How on earth do some people come up with a belief in God? Well, there are people who believe in God or some higher power, but cannot quite elaborate why. They just say, I just believe in God because, I don't know, that's my tradition, or I've had some kind of experience, or it feels right to me, and I don't need any reasons for it. And I think that's a total shame, because they're actually saying, hey, whether my view of life makes rational sense or not doesn't matter. In all fairness, you might also ask, okay, do you also believe in magic carpets or in Santa Claus? Or are you thinking about anything at all? It's funny, in 1,000 life situations, we really think hard, like which car to buy. But some people think belief is just a feeling, and you have to know it deep down, or, yeah, I had a warm feeling one day. But my claim is that at least in the Christian faith, and I think also in the Jewish faith, it's not about throwing your brain out or saying, just go into something irrational that feels good and comforting. I think this is very much a rational matter, and we urgently need to deal with these issues. It doesn't matter whether you believe or not. Questions like, is there anything to support the thesis that God exists or not, are crucial questions about which we need to become able to speak intellectually. Now, let's take a look at the established findings first. All over the world and across all ages and cultures, there are billions of people who believe in a godly entity. And when you start thinking about the function of this belief, the reasons for belief, you keep coming back to three things. First of all, people believe in God because they say, through faith I have certain answers to humanity's questions. Answers to questions like, where do we come from? How did the world come about? Or what happens after we die? It's the same across all religions. By the way, it's interesting, it's not true that religiosity basically stops when people are more educated or with scientific progress happening. Some do, some become atheists, but many don't. You can also see this in the Western enlightened nations, especially when you look at the USA. They are a highly technological civilization, but people still believe in God. Why is that? For one, there are some kinds of answers. The question then is whether you find them credible or not, but first there are answers. The second is there are people who have certain experiences, and then they say, well, I had a religious experience. There are people who say, I just prayed and then it warmed my heart. Or, my grandma, she died, but then I saw her in a dream again. You can't deny that. Across all religions and across all human history, many people say, I had a religious experience, and we need a theory for that. Where does it come from? The last thing is, why do humans have such questions at all? So, if there were no God, or if we were just matter, why do people have the wish for the good and not the bad? For justice? Or the questions about life after death? We have the God question. Where do these fundamentals questions actually come from? Basic questions. Now I'll draw some people. Because it's sort of the issue. Why do we humans, in contrast to animals, have these questions? Also about religion, for example. Why do we even think about it? Now, religious people say all these things have something to do with God. By the way, I don't claim at all that I can bring you a proof of God's existence. I don't even think there is one. There is no proof of God. But there is a web of plausibility. That means there are certain indications that when looking at them, believing in God seems at least as plausible, or even more plausible than not believing in Him. You don't get that much further. You cannot prove what is true or not, but you can say there is at least as much evidence for it as against it, maybe even more. My thesis is there is more rational evidence to encourage believing in God than there is for not believing in Him. But I'm far from saying that God can be proved. That's nonsense. But many atheists come along with the claim religious belief is nonsense because it's illogical. And I think they're going too far there. First, let's see how atheists argue that faith doesn't provide plausible answers, how religious experiences are not to be taken seriously, and why the basic questions we humans have do not lead to the acceptance of a God. And the first argument is, science tells us everything there is to know. Physics explores how the universe is built. Brain research can explain how we humans function, and anything beyond that is just mumbo-jumbo. Yeah, you can believe in it if you want, in the same way you can believe in a spaghetti monster floating in the sky, but it doesn't make any sense. Everything we can know is science. The second argument is, even if there were a God, the suffering in the world would speak against His goodness or even His very existence. So they would say, hey, look at the universe. If there is a God behind it, He's either evil, but it's even more likely that He just doesn't exist. Their next argument is, the basic questions about morality and so on derive from the evolutionary need for morality. The human race figured out that things work better when everyone follows rules. And at some point, a personalized superego developed, and then religion emerged from that. And finally, they would say, of course there are religious experiences, but in the end, they are something like a mental disorder, or people just imagine it. In fact, you keep coming across these four arguments under the term new atheists. There are also people who write books under this title. Richard Dawkins, for example, is well known. It's certainly not the smartest book, but it's the most popular. He actually calls it God delusion. He says it's a God of delusion and really uses that expression. Well, I don't pretend to be able to refute that in passing. Later, I want to present an argument why belief in God is absolutely logical and sound. But I just want to point out in passing why these four arguments aren't as cogent as they seem at first glance. There are a lot of books on all of this. It's always the question of how deep you want to go into it. If you are a convinced atheist, you won't feel refuted by my short replies because you've probably read a lot about it as well. There are broad discussions and extremely good arguments on either side. No side is made up of idiots. There are good arguments, but I think the rebuttals I'm going to present you show why it's not so easy to make these arguments. I'll start with the fourth, with the mental disorder. First of all, the problem is, if you have a psychosis, and when you say that someone is mentally disturbed, it's harsh when 5% of humanity says that 95% of people have a mental disorder. It's a bit like the ghost driver on the freeway claiming that everyone else is driving in the wrong direction. Sorry, no. A mind-blowing number of people in the world believe in God. Telling them they're mentally disturbed is at least foolhardy. It's not impossible, but it's quite audacious. Now, if you certify a disorder and say your brain doesn't work properly, it's like saying your life doesn't work. The alcoholic isn't just an alcoholic, but he cannot keep his life together anymore. He's a heavy alcoholic because he cannot get his life under control. And the schizoid can no longer drive a car because he has a delusion, and so on. And so it's striking that you cannot prove that believers no longer function in life. It's rather the opposite. If 95% of humanity were completely unviable, our world would look completely different. There is no indication of this. There is also no indication that in East Germany, where hardly anyone believes in God, people are happier, smarter, and more successful than in Western Germany, where many more people believe in God. In fact, it's the opposite. Psychological research shows that there is a correlation between faith and mental stability. Other studies make a point in showing that people who became emotionally healthy often did so in connection with faith. The 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous takes into assumption a higher being that you can contact. That means you would have to say it's the other way around. Exactly the opposite is the case. We have evidence that religious belief is a part of mental health rather than of mental illness. Of course, there is by far no proof for the existence of God, but this fourth one is definitely too sharply stated. So that's just in passing. It's not that easy to say. So, the next one. The morality serves an evolutionary purpose. First of all, that's a little too easy said because morality is only one of many things. There's more to come. For example, there is also the human urge to find out the truth. The idea, truth is better than lies. Now, when you say it comes through evolution, evolution assumes that species adapt, so thus survive better. Yeah, it's fitness. But now there are things in morality or in the search for truth that can cost one's lives. For example, if a repressive government gives you the order, torture that man or I'll kill you, many people would say, I'd rather die before doing that. That means the individual perceives this moral law, or the law of telling the truth, as superior to survival. But that's the opposite of what an evolutionist model says, because survival of the species is paramount. It doesn't go far enough. And even if you say, yeah, okay, but maybe the whole clan's survival depends on it, but that still doesn't explain why I should do it. So evolution can explain, for example, why I have a sex drive. Well, because reproduction is good, but I can decide whether I follow it or not. In the case of a moral law, I can also make a decision, but the law applies independently of it. I know it's wrong to do that. And there is also no culture, as far as I know, where it's a moral action to betray your friends or to be cowardly when faced with danger. I don't know of any culture. There is an amazing harmony on certain basic moral principles. That means it's not that easy. And of course it becomes even more dramatic when you consider that these questions aren't only ethical ones, but also, for example, questions about life after death or about religion. Now you can say, hey, if evolution makes us fitter for our environment, then why did evolution produce religion? It would be more of a counter-argument. So in evolution, species develop abilities to assert themselves. Then why does man develop religion if there is nothing behind it? So you could almost turn it around and say, if it arose through evolution, it's definitely an interesting argument and you should take it seriously. That means this argument isn't strong either. Let's move on. The suffering in the world is a strong argument against it. In Georg Büchner's famous drama Danton's Death, written in 1830 or 40, one of the characters says, suffering is the bedrock of atheism. As long as any creature in the universe suffers, it's an argument that there cannot be a good God. And Dostoevsky has a similar reasoning in Brothers Karamazov. So it's a big topic in world literature. If God is good and omnipotent, why does he not prevent evil? The problem is, you cannot say objectively whether the universe is good or bad from just any perspective. First of all, you would have to stand at the end of the story and say, wow, this equation really didn't add up. Or you would have to look over it from above and then evaluate it objectively. Don't get me wrong, I don't mean to be cynical. When someone is going through great suffering, I can totally understand them saying, I can no longer believe in a good God. That is more than understandable. But you shouldn't confuse a personal experience with an objective assessment. Whether at the end of human history, people will look back and decide it was worth it or not, none of us can say. We don't know that. A 4-year-old also finds it unfair that I don't give him a second scoop of ice cream, because I know that he already has tooth decay. But he thinks it's bad. And from an adult's point, I say, no, it's not bad. That just shows that things are judged differently from different perspectives. Well, there is suffering in the universe. There is terrible suffering. But it's not for us to say that there cannot be a higher plan because of it. We don't know that. That is, this argument is at least not absolutely conclusive. But it goes even deeper. When an atheist says, this world is unjust and full of suffering, therefore there cannot be a God, then you can say, who on earth planted this desire for justice in you? Where do these questions come from, if we were just a product of evolution? I mean, a fox doesn't write a book about how unfair the world is because his mate just died. Do you get it? Humans have these questions. Point being, why do we have them if we were just predators? If we only eat and reproduce, then we should think it's normal. Some die, others don't. But we don't think it's normal. We find it unjust when a good person dies too soon. Why do we think it's unfair? Why do we rebel? Because there's something in us that says the world should be good. The world should be just. The exciting question is, how on earth does this question get into the heart of man? How on earth does the longing for justice, the longing for eternal life, and for truth get into the heart of men, even into the heart of the atheist? He's outraged that Christians are hypocrites. He's incredibly outraged that there is sexual abuse in some seminaries for priests. Those are issues that people get upset about, and you can only agree with them and say, it's really outrageous, it's terrible. But how do you get the idea that the world should be just? Who put that in you if we were just highly evolved animals? Where did it come from? Well, the question is related to something deeper, which we will look at later. But this argument is certainly not compelling, at least. The suffering in the world does not argue against an ordering principle, because there could be one that is of a higher order that we don't perceive. In addition, we find order in the world. For example, in us, this longing for justice or order in the world, that there is also good, which could turn the argument around and say, where does it actually come from when there is nothing behind it? Okay, it's a big issue in philosophy. I cannot completely diffuse it. By crossing it out, I'm just showing that I try to talk about it. I'll go a little deeper into the following point. The natural sciences explain what needs to be explained, and beyond that, there may only be feelings or personal preferences. First of all, it's pretty important to say there is no consensus among scientists on the questions of God. That's important to know. If you were to ask scientists of all disciplines, do you believe in God or not? You'll have a higher proportion of atheists among scientists than in general population, but you are far from a consensus. So if science would lead to atheism with great reliability, then this percentage would have to be pretty high, at 80 or 90%. But that's not the case, and there is no sign of it. Even among the great researchers of the 20th century, such as Heisenberg, Planck, and so on, There are impressive examples of believers. Even today, there is no consensus among philosophers, astrophysicists, and biologists that there is no God. That's giving too much weight to this argument. And finally, science explains everything that needs to be explained. That's just not true. There are important questions, essentially four, which science cannot explain and for which no explanation is in sight. The first question is, why is there anything at all and not rather nothing? The second is, why is the universe the way it is? The third, why is there life at all? And the fourth is, why is there consciousness and mind? These four questions are not a God of the gaps. Some atheists say, yeah, these are the last gaps we still have. One day we'll close them too. That's total nonsense, because they are getting bigger and bigger. 150 years ago, all these gaps looked much smaller. Nobody knew how complex DNA is. You thought the first life arose from the mud. Today we know the first life is quite complex. They used to believe the universe was infinitely large and old. That was common sense about 120 years ago. Stupidly, the Big Bang was discovered just 20 years later. That's something that speaks much more strongly for a creator, and there are many more examples. Also, what Darwin expected from the theory of evolution. A few decades later, you saw, wow, it's much more complex than Darwin suspected. That means you cannot say that we are close to finding the last pieces of the puzzle. It's getting more and more complex. A scientist friend of mine once said, he's a molecular physician, it's the task of natural science to turn one question into two. That's how science works. The deeper you look, the more you realize it's getting more and more complex. So forget the statement, we are about to have explained the world. Newton thought so. Newtonian mechanics, a few hundred years ago, was a complete and awesome model for describing the world. Oh damn, now we have quantum theory, which makes everything much more complicated. Quantum theory is much further from explaining the world than Newtonian mechanics was. And that's just in the realm of mechanics. The same applies to many other areas. That means it's simply not true that science is close to answering every question that exists. Later on, we will ask even deeper questions. Which kind of questions does natural science really answer? The simple answer is questions that have to do with nature. That is what the term means. So which questions will science never be able to answer? Exactly everything that does not have to do with nature. For example, where does nature come from? The question, where does everything come from, cannot be a question of natural science, because natural science examines only something that exists. It's not that hard to understand. Okay. So that's not really convincing either. Finally, let's see, what could a theistic argument look like? Theistic just means it has to do with God. So, what could a theistic argument look like? And then we will see if we can defend it. So my theistic argument is, belief in God is a logical and a sufficient answer to the following question. And I'm not saying that it's mandatory. I'm not saying there cannot be another, but I'm saying it's a logical, sufficient, simple, and elegant one. First, why is there anything at all rather than nothing? Second, why is the universe the way it is? Because we will see later, if it were otherwise, we or the planets wouldn't exist at all. Why is the universe the way it is? Third, why is there life in the universe? Fourth, why does the mind exist? Then the basic questions of man. Why do people search for meaning, truth, justice, love, and beauty? And finally, why are there religious experiences? Again, I assert the assumption of a God as a logical and sufficient explanation for the questions of why something exists at all. Why is the universe ordered in a way that makes life and intelligent life possible? Why is there life? Why is there consciousness? Finally, why do people have questions like, what's the truth? What is good? Does eternity exist? Does God exist? Finally, why do people have religious experiences? Why do people dream of heaven or rebirth? It's in all religions. And now I say, atheism not only has no answers to all these questions, it doesn't even have a theory as to why we have these questions at all. But atheism just says, well, these questions are unanswerable, so stop with your stupid assumptions about a God. Not only does it have no answers, it doesn't even have a theory as to why we have these questions. And that's why I don't think it's convincing. I'm not discounting agnosticism today. So if someone says, I don't want to think about it, I don't care, that's another topic. But if someone says, I assert there is no God, then I would say, okay, you have no answer to all these questions, not even a theory as to why we have them, therefore not convincing. Not because I've had an experience, that's not the point, just purely intellectually.
Have you noticed there are no ads on this channel? This is the only one. There's one reason for that. This channel is funded by donations only. If you want to help us to continue with this work, you find everything about supporting us below in the description. Now enjoy the rest of the video.
Okay, I'm going to try to present an argument that answers these questions and that says why you can rationally, logically, and responsibly believe in God. And that's my reasoning, which proceeds in the following steps. First, I'd like to look at the subject of naturalism with you. Naturalism is the widespread assumption that natural science has answers to all questions. That's what a lot of people believe in these days, and I'm trying to show why naturalism is necessarily self-contradictory and therefore fails. It doesn't work. I will then introduce a thesis that says anything that begins to exist also has a cause. It's a quite simple argument. Nothing comes from nothing. At least with things that begin to exist, you can't say that. Yeah, it's just happened spontaneously. That's not so easy to say. And then I'm going to make the argument that the universe is definitely one of those things. Yeah? The universe began to exist. Namely, it began to exist with the event we call the Big Bang. Again, people didn't know before that it can be proven physically and cosmologically that there was a point where the universe, including space and time, came into existence. That means the universe is definitely one of those things that began to exist. Now you can say, okay, now you want to assert that God created the universe. Well, no. There are two evasive theories, and I want to take a look at them with you. The first one is, I'll draw it with lots of infinity signs. That's the multiverse theory. The multiverse theory says there are many universes in real life and ours is just the one we know or the one that's left behind. We'll look at that. And the second is, yeah, okay, if God created everything, then who created God? So where does God come from? That is, the argument goes like this. explaining an unexplainable universe in terms of a God whose origin I cannot explain is a sleight of hand, because it pushes the problem just one step further. And that is a serious rejoinder that we will look at. So, who created God? Now, after going through these two things, I'll claim that many things speak for the assumption of a creator. Or I'll argue why I believe there is a creator, and that this one creator created not only the laws of nature, but also the moral law in our hearts. So, then it's about the human being and the fact that this creator is not just a cosmic energy, but has something to do with these basic questions in the heart of the human being. How should I live? How will I be happy? And I'll try to argue point by point. And you just can listen and see if it convinces you. And if it doesn't convince you, ask yourself, does it not convince me because I don't like the assumption of a God? Or is there really an intellectual point that does not convince you? In both cases, you can learn something. First of all, and this is almost the most important point, the topic of naturalism. Many people believe in it. Naturalism says, okay, natural science is like solving puzzles, and it's pretty advanced. People used to believe in God or in the gods, in Zeus or something like that. But today we know that no gods live on top of the mountains. And science drives out faith more and more. In a few years or decades, science will have drawn a more and more complete picture of the world and will have solved even the last problems that something like supernatural elements, a God who intervenes, and so on. As Laplace said, God is a hypothesis I don't need. So it will have explained everything, and then you no longer need to assume a God. First of all, is this worldview understandable? Simple answer, it's totally understandable, because the natural sciences are so successful. And we should be careful not to speak badly of science, because without it there wouldn't be antibiotics, and then you could just die with the next illness. In other words, natural science is extremely successful. So it's understandable to say, let's build on what we really know, and not on old books or some hocus pocus. So let's stay with natural sciences and ask, but how does natural sciences work? And which questions does it answer and which does it not answer? Let's look at an example. Imagine a child playing around a well that is surrounded by very low stones. It is very deep and has no railings. And the adults were just drinking coffee and being distracted, and then the child stumbles and falls into the well. Now is the question, how could this happen? Do you know what the scientist answers? How could this happen? Gravity. Newtonian mechanics of falling. Center of Earth, masses attracted. This is the scientific description of the facts. And it's correct, but it's only a minimal extract. There is a multitude of other questions. For example, why didn't anyone build a railing there? Or was the child careless? Did the child have a mental disorder? Was it dizzy? Was it sick? Was it pushed? Were the parents distracted? Why was the child allowed to play at all? None of these questions are touched upon by the natural scientific description. Yeah, the Prague defenestration. It brought about the 30-year war. How did it happen? Gravity. That's true, but it's only a small part of it. That means natural science works best when it counts and measures. Yeah, it cuts open an organ and examines it. A living organ can no longer be properly studied by natural science. That means that natural science always abstracts from the whole of being, from normal life, picks out one question and answers it. And it's extremely good at it. But the more global the theories become, the more speculative they become. Therefore, theories are not just findings. Theories are also models that work for a while until new theories come along. Therefore, the belief that science can provide a complete description of the world one day is an ideology. That's not natural science. Natural science can never answer all questions. Yeah? If you go to the doctor and say, "I'm lovesick, what should I do?" then the doctor won't be able to tell you if she really suits you or not, and whether you are capable of a relationship. That's not really their job as a scientist or as a doctor. All they can say is, organically, you're fine. Yeah, but we humans are concerned with so many questions that are not organic. Let me give you another great example. Imagine a scientist discovered this somewhere. And now the scientist will claim, that's a text. It's Sanskrit, and it was written by someone. Now a scientist could say, an author supposedly wrote that. Prove it to me. Let me investigate it and see if I can find an author. I'll examine these black particles under the microscope. There is no author in there. There's none to be found. Or let's look at the surroundings of these black snippets. There is no author in there either. Why should that matter at all? The meaning is, you're just making that up, spaghetti monster. Yeah, it's all in your head. Author, exactly. Magic carpet, Santa Claus. All we can say scientifically, that's a lot of carbon. And the scientist is right. Because it is not the job of the biologist, the chemist, or the physicist to say whether those are letters and mean something, and whether an author wrote them. That's another question. You understand it? Even a complete physical description of the world, the way molecules and atoms work, would be nothing but a study of these carbon particles. But the scientist would have to step back as a human being and say, hey, what does it all mean and why is that? But you'll never find the author in the ink. And just as much, a natural scientist will never be able to give scientific proof as to whether God exists or not. I always have these discussions online. Yeah, if God existed, if He gave us one proof, any attempt to prove a miracle scientifically also fails. Example, there was a fisherman one day, and the fisherman tried to study all living things that live in the sea. All of them. And therefore he cast a net and caught many fish. He caught fish and caught jellyfish. And he found starfish and lots of other cool stuff. And he has set out to establish the first fundamental rule of marine biology. And it says, all creatures living in the sea are larger than 2 centimeters. That was his result. And what has he never done? He never measured the mesh size of his net. With this net, you can only catch things that are larger than 2 centimeters. With scientific glasses on, you will only get answers to scientific questions. And that's okay too. That's okay. And I'm telling you, there are a lot of Christians who have big theories about evolution and Big Bang and so on, and I don't have a strong opinion about that. But I'll tell you this, even a complete description of the Big Bang, of the origin of life and of evolution, even if it all were proven, the only incredible mega question would still remain unanswered, and that is, why? It's like when you ask yourself, where do I come from? Then I tell you, you used to be a very small cell and then you grew up. Yeah, that's right. It's a causal chain and a description of how, but it's not yet an explanation of why. And I believe that science is still a long way from being able to answer all of these questions. But we have to realize you can only get certain answers with a certain set of methods. And many people who believe in naturalism confuse methodical atheism with dogmatic one. So methodical means when I examine why this element reacts with another one, you cannot say God did it. No, if you're a scientist, you have to assume that you can explain it naturally. Otherwise, you can go home. That's logical. But methodical atheism doesn't mean an ideological one. Methodical atheism only says, in this experiment, I'll try to explain everything with natural causes because I'm a scientist. But the same scientist comes home in the evening and his wife asks him, do you still love me? And he replies, let's do a chemical experiment first. No, he won't, right? There are questions in his life that he will answer differently. There are thousands of questions that need to be answered differently than with this 2-centimeter net. And why on earth should the question of whether God exists and whether there is meaning in life be one of the kind to which science can give us the answer? So they often say, yeah, if science cannot answer the question, then it's just pointless. And that's nonsense. That's dogmatic, because there are thousands of questions that can't be answered scientifically. And now I'll tell you a sentence that only a few will understand, especially only a few naturalists. I've asked many, but they never could answer it. Naturalists say, natural science can explain everything. Then I say, okay, you think only scientific sentences can be true sentences, don't you? Then they say yes. The only problem is, this sentence is not a scientific sentence. Again, the sentence, only sentences of natural science can be true. This sentence is a philosophical one. You can never prove it. It's a religious sentence. It's a sentence of belief. And that's why naturalism is self-contradictory. If it's true, it's not true. So if it were true, it would need one sentence that you just firmly believe in. Or you say, hey, all we can know is naturalism, and we can't say anything beyond that. It's like Wittgenstein's magnum opus, which says, things you cannot talk about those keep your silence. But that's agnosticism. That's different. They say, I'm doing my science. Furthermore, if you want to be religious, why not? But that's different. Naturalism says beyond that there is no knowledge. And that's not true. Because you will find knowledge on all kinds of things that are not found in natural science. For example, the circular number pi. Let's set up an experiment that proves the circular number pi chemically or physically. Forget it. It's a different kind of logical reasoning, namely a mathematical one. You cannot measure a perfect circle in the universe. It doesn't exist. But you can still calculate the circle number pi. We will come back to these questions a little later. One who has thought deeply about this is a philosopher named Thomas Nagel. He wrote a book a few years ago. He's not a Christian, not even a theist. But he wrote a book called Mind and Cosmos, with the subtitle, Why the Materialistic Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly Wrong. The book elicited screams of dismay because he simply said, you guys seriously believe that a human mind examines the universe and comes to the conclusion, there is no mind? That's what materialism says. There is only matter. Exactly. You use your mind to say that there is no mind. Are you kidding me? So the thing is absolutely self-contradictory. And then evolutionists say, yeah, well, evolution has somehow produced consciousness. But before that, there was no consciousness. It's emergent. Out of the mud comes life, and out of the life comes thinking objects. The question is, why on earth? And he sets the good example. He says, If you take a calculator and type in 4 plus 4, you know what comes out? 8. And materialists say exactly, where does the 8 come from? Well, you typed in 4 plus 4. But we ask, how does the calculator know that? Where does this algorithm come from? Why does it work that way? You can basically ask that. People say, yeah, that's the nature. It acts according to the laws of nature. That's puzzling enough. Why do all molecules in the universe actually behave in the same way? Have you ever thought about that? Even if illusion emerged from itself, and then people emerged from it saying there is no God, even if that was the true story, you'd have to say, how on earth is it possible that the universe that made us is dumber than us? Seriously, we have a mind, but we say there is no mind in the universe? But there is. For example, you have one in your head. At least that's what you have to assume. Thomas Nagel says, conscious subjects and their mental life are inevitable components of reality and cannot be described by physical science. So science cannot describe what it feels like to be Patrick Gruber or whatever your name is, Stefan Meyer or Anna Hartl, my daughter. Or how it feels to be newly in love or to be scared. Subjective feeling is part of our world. Science is unable to describe that. Science is always an outside perspective. So you see, I'm getting a bit philosophical now, but I think it's very interesting. One last thing. Thomas Nagel says, that's so good. Some atheists say, our mind doesn't really respond to truth, but only to what we have learned from the apes, and then interpersonal manners have prevailed. Then you say, then there is no truth, only fitness, only survival. And Thomas Nagel says, evolutionist naturalism says that we shouldn't take any of our beliefs seriously, not even the scientific worldview on which evolutionist naturalism is based. So if we are just higher evolved mammals that have learned to survive, well, then our propositions can't be true. Then they are just as valuable as a yawn, which, by the way, is an expression of something, namely that I'm tired, but that cannot be true or false. But if that's your opinion, then the sentence you just said isn't true either. Or say right away there is truth, but where does it come from then? Why do humans react to it? Okay, so much about naturalism. Now you know why I don't find it convincing. If that hasn't convinced you yet, just read Mind and Cosmos by Thomas Nagel. For example, we humans find logical laws that are not just simply in nature. One law of logic, for example, is that the same proposition cannot be true and false at the same time. In other words, if you see an apple, but it doesn't look like an apple from the other side, then you don't need an extra sensory impression to verify it. Your head already tells you that something is wrong. You don't find the law of logic in things. We humans discover them like mathematical laws. There isn't just matter. That's not true. There is mind. And the question is, where does it come from? And now we come to the following claim. What begins to exist also has a cause. Then you say, well, it doesn't have to. It can be a singularity after all. The universe just exists. Okay. If I tell you, I go into the forest, and I see a big and shiny ball. That wasn't there yesterday. Where did that come from? And someone says, there is no explanation for this ball, it's just there. Then you say, well, it wouldn't convince you. Question, would the problem be less significant if the ball was 100 meters high? No. How about if the ball is as large as the whole universe? The problem wouldn't be smaller. And that's exactly the problem we face. We have a universe that suddenly begins to exist in the Big Bang. And people say, yeah, that comes from the Big Bang. No, the question is, where did the Big Bang come from? Then you say, from coincidence, from chance. C.S. Lewis put it so well. It must be a well-tuned coincidence that it produces a universe and not just a case of beer. Okay, let's look at that. Everything that begins to exist also has a cause. Now you might add, yes, but the cause itself could also have a cause again, and so on. Sometimes that is linked to the multiverse theory. They say there was a universe that met with another, separated, came together, and so on into infinity. So it has no cause, but it's infinite. Have you heard that before? The problem is, imagine a hotel. It's the Hilbert's Hotel. It's named after a mathematician. The hotel room has an infinite number of rooms. How many people would have to check in until it's fully booked? It's difficult. If you say there were an infinite number of events before the Big Bang, you have to say, but how many events must there be that at some point there is this present day? Infinitely many. So you can never arrive at the present day. So infinity works mathematically, but it doesn't mean it works in causal origins. You know, if the universe had another cause, and that in turn had another, you can't go back into infinity because you would never arrive at the present day. You would need an infinite number of events to arrive at the present day. But how many would that take? It doesn't make sense. Then people say, maybe the universe caused itself. Wait, that means it existed before it existed. It's pointless. The universe belongs to the class of objects that began to exist. And we wouldn't let that pass on any other issue. If you said a tree suddenly grew, it has no cause. Yes, it does. It has a cause. Someone planted an acorn or something else before. People also didn't spontaneously appear out of nowhere. No, there was a dad and a mom before. If you said, no, it's different for me, it would be at least difficult. What begins to exist also has a cause. Now the universe starts to exist, and then you say, ha, gotcha. By the way, Stephen Hawking, the physicist who died recently, said, the universe came into being out of nothing. There are a few philosophers or scientists who would say, came from nothing. But if you look closely what they mean by nothing, the nothing is not really nothing. They rather say there were some quantum vibrations in the vacuum and everything came out of it. Yeah, sure, but where did they come from? Those vibrations must have been pretty impressive in order to bring a universe into being where you can talk about how everything came from nothing. So it was a not too bad nothing in the beginning. The philosopher Leibniz asked the question, why is there something at all and not rather nothing? And the sentence that nothing comes from nothing without a causer cannot be refuted, in my opinion. I don't know how to logically disprove it. Maybe you can tell me. Now you can say, okay, so the universe came into being. But there is an even bigger problem with the universe. It didn't just come about. It came about very specifically. And that is a topic called cosmological fine-tuning. You can read about it on the internet. There is a lot of argument about this, and some people say that doesn't exist at all, and some say there is. The thing is, the universe follows a series of very specific laws from the beginning. For example, there is the cosmological constant, or the expansion rate of the universe. That means at the moment of the Big Bang, it goes bam, and the universe expands. But it doesn't expand randomly, but at an absolute precise speed. And if this speed would be different by, here it comes, not only 1 to 100, but by 10 to 27, that is 100 trillion, the universe would either collapse or would expand so fast that the formation of stars and galaxies would have been impossible. And that's just one of those laws. The second is, there is a connection between the electromagnetic and strong nuclear force. If there was only an absurdly minimal difference, molecules would not exist. Same goes for the mass of protons and electrons. There is a series of such constants. Some people argue about individual ones. They say, yeah, no, the universe would also be possible differently. But when you put all these things together, you'd have to say the universe isn't just any one. If only an absurdly small part were different. There couldn't be a sun or carbon. Carbon is pretty, well, it wouldn't be nice if there weren't any carbon, because then there wouldn't be life at all. That is, you'd have to ask, how on earth did a universe like this just come out of it? And if you go further and ask, how on earth did a universe come into being where life is possible? Well, I'm not going deeper into the individual arguments now, but the emergence of life from lifelessness is just awe-inspiring. 100 years ago, it was significantly easier to believe in it because you didn't even know how a cell was constructed. So people believe under the keyword abiogenesis that the first primordial cell arose from such large proteins that somehow got together and then gave origin to life. This is what the nucleus of the simplest cell looked like. Okay, the simplest cell in existence weighs less than a trillionth of a gram, according to geneticist Michael Denton, and is a true micro-miniature factory with thousands of perfectly designed parts of a complicated molecular machine, consisting altogether of, what do you think, how many atoms does it consist of? And all the atoms have to be in the right place, by the way. How many? What do you think? Exactly 100 billion atoms. So not just 10,000. 10,000 is already a lot, but 100 billion. And that makes it far more complicated than any man-made machine. The simplest cell is infinitely more complex than the most complicated man-made machine. The problem is that we've also known this here for a few decades. Namely that inside this nucleus, there is an incredibly complex strand of molecules called DNA, or in plants it's called RNA, which is a coded system. That means there is meaning in there. And there are metabolic processes that read this meaning and convert it into bodily processes. And that is just the simplest bacterium. So the first cell should have been created spontaneously, without anyone writing this code, which is, by the way, millions of entries long. That convinces some, but not many. In any case, we see that our universe is not just any universe. And then people say evolution did it. Evolution didn't do that. Evolution doesn't do anything. In every nature documentary, how wonderful the nature has produced it. Nature doesn't produce anything. The interesting thing is, why does the nature do what it does? People say, it's just due to the laws of nature. Yeah, but where do they come from? That's the question. Why do they all behave the same way? That's gravity. Yeah, what does that prove? It just shows that there is a force, but we don't know where it comes from. So stop this nonsense. Science is on the verge of explaining everything. Putting a name tag on a phenomenon, such as gravity, is not the same thing as explaining it. So, quick trip, multiverse theory, and where does God come from? We see the universe started to exist. It's incredibly complex. Then people say, yes, but that's just the only one that has prevailed. In reality, there are trillions of universes, and then the question of why it's so well ordered is off the table. Our universe just happens to be the only one that has produced life. That's nothing else than saying, I can't explain where the pink elephant came from. So I assume there are 100 million pink elephants, and this is just the only one that survived. Great. That only shows how dramatically huge the problem is to explain that. You can forget it. It's just the attempt to avoid the logical necessity that from here to there, this conclusion here is a compelling one. Now you can say, yeah, but where does God come from then? Let me answer that quickly. Where does God come from? Physical objects have causal origins. This glass here was made under certain conditions from certain chemical substances. Non-physical objects do not necessarily have causal origins. Only things that begin to exist have causal origins. But there are things that do not begin to exist. For example, who made the number 3? Who actually designed the circular number pi? We humans cannot change, but only discover them. How about the laws of logic? Like the same proposition cannot be true and false at the same time. Who designed that? It's just there. There are things that are just there. They don't need a causal origin. And those are things that don't belong to the class of physical objects. I don't know of any theist who claims that God is a physical object. So I don't see why God would need a causal origin. If you assume a God who doesn't belong to the class of physical objects, that is, who doesn't begin to exist, there is simply no reason to assume that he came into being. There is no problem in explaining who created the circular number pi. It's just there. God is a necessary being. That doesn't prove that he exists, but if he does, then there is no point in asking where he comes from, because he is the answer to that, because he holds the beginning of all being in itself. There is no logical contradiction there. Make sense? Material objects have causal origin. Other objects, such as numbers, don't. You may say, but a number usually doesn't produce a universe. That's correct. But an immortal spirit could easily do that. We also don't know where the human spirit comes from. We don't know that. We discover it. Man has it, and he can respond to the truth. Just saying that there is no mind in the universe, but there is in us, that's not convincing. Why shouldn't there be a person who is spirit and non-material, who has no origin and who created everything? There is absolutely no reason not to accept that. Assuming a creator would be a full explanation, first of all, to these questions. Where does everything come from? Why is there life and mind? It would coincide with religious experiences. They differ among religions, but basically, there is an intuition that there's something higher. What it's called and how to worship it is another topic, but it would fit together, and it's the perfect answer to the question of why we even have these questions. That is, it's a stringent and plausible solution. Now you can only ask, what kind of a creator does it have to be? Then you'll have to say, well, if he can create a universe, he has to be pretty powerful, he has to be quite intelligent, and he doesn't need to be caused himself. If he himself had a cause, then he has a creator in turn. So I don't know. Then there would be an intermediate God. You can accept that if you want, but that doesn't interest me. I'm only interested in the first one. Otherwise, we would have this problem with infinity again. I'm talking about the first one, and the assumption of such a God is logical and complete. There's nothing illogical about it. It's just that it bothers us somehow. And there are people who take offense at this assumption deep down. And why they take offense, I contend, has to do with that red arrow. That is, if there is a creator, then he has something to do with my heart, and then he wants something from me. The point is, we observe in nature the laws of nature. That is, the molecules don't just do what they want. They behave according to these laws. The thing is, we humans have a moral law too. Everyone has it, even atheists. An atheist might say, well, for some this is right, for others that. Then you say, aha. So you think there are societies where it's okay to violate children? No, of course not. Oh, you just contradicted yourself then. So do you think that children should never be violated? Yes, of course. And that's why the Catholics... Calm down. I was just pointing out that there is a moral law. Okay. Do you really think that you always conduct yourself according to the moral law? Every honest person would say, no, I don't always. And then I say, oh, that's interesting. We humans are the only ones in the universe who don't always do what the law says. No apple says, gravity doesn't apply to me today. It always behaves accordingly. We humans are the only link in the chain that rebels. And that's what the Bible means by saying that due to man's refusal to align himself with God, suffering, corruption, death, and all that came about. That is possible. Imagine a clockwork. There is a central wheel around which everything else revolves. Yeah, if that turns wrong, the whole clock is broken. As far as we know, we humans are the only part in the universe that can think and that can choose between good and evil. Therefore, if the person chooses the wrong thing, and this picture is correct, then the consequences are serious. And Christianity teaches exactly that the consequences are serious, but that God himself, by becoming man, initiated the great rescue plan to get his clockwork running again. But I can't get rid of my suspicion atheists are funny. They say, yeah, you Christians, you just don't want to face the facts that we are mortal, and that's why you believe in God. It's just a consolation. At the same time, atheists say, you Christians make life so difficult. With your sexual morality, relax, imagine there's no heaven. And I always say, which is it now? Do you think accepting a God will comfort me or make my life sad? One of those must be wrong. I've also asked that a famous German atheist. He couldn't give me an answer. He said, kind of both. And I said, yeah, kind of both. Of course, belief in God is a comfort because it's an incredibly satisfying and sufficient answer to the basic questions. But it also demands something of me, because if this Creator has created everything, then the question is, what does He expect from me? What was His intention? And the assumption that there is someone above me who could tell me how I should live is not so easy for the ego to grasp. And I assume that many people who don't believe in God actually don't believe in God for that reason. They say, wait, there's supposed to be someone who tells me who to sleep with? Forget it. Or how else to live. Stop this nonsense. I think that this, as well as abuse by authority figures or experiencing suffering, are the real reasons why people don't believe in God. And those are matters of the heart. The question is why people then make up a description of the world in which life is possible without God. And it is possible without God. You can design a world system around these questions with multiverses and emergence from nothing. But seen in the light, it's 1,000 times more complicated and less plausible than the simple answer that 95% of humanity has a correct intuition that we come from somewhere, that there is a cause, and that it has something to do with the questions in our hearts, how to live, and if there's life after death, or religious experiences around the globe. I absolutely don't believe that God can be proved. But I do believe that if you approach these issues with an open heart, you probably will be faced with deep questions. Like, okay, would I even want that? Do I want to face the truth? And I think anyone who then says, yes, I want that, I want the truth more than anything, I believe they will find God. A book came out a few years ago. When I wrote my doctoral thesis, he was one of the most famous atheists, and I have dealt with his arguments. Anthony Flew. He was one of the greatest minds of atheism in the 20th century. And at the end of his life, he wrote a book called There Is a God. Subtitle, how the world's most notorious atheist changed his mind. It's a bit sensational, but he says, actually, if he looks at how the universe is made and how DNA is made, he says, actually, the most obvious and plausible thing to assume is that God exists. A lot of people were led down such a path to God. And he says he only got there because he made the decision, I'll go where the evidence takes me. He said, I'm a scientist. I'll believe what is most plausible. I won't settle for anything half plausible. And I think if you read these books, and then you read a book by Richard Dawkins or something like that, you will come to an answer. And I have the suspicion that it will be an answer that assumes that believe in God is a sufficient answer to the basic questions, and one that will make human life more whole, happier, more real and true. Personally, I believe that faith in God doesn't just save somehow, because the most horrible things have been done in the name of God. Rather, I believe that God, Jesus spoke about, and to whom Jesus paves the way, is the God who saves and heals people. I'm not saying there are multiple gods, but there are multiple versions of what God looks like, and there are different views on that. But mainly, the assumption of a God is plausible, rational, and in my opinion, the more convincing alternative.